So we'd like to explore this question of maturation. What does that mean? What does it mean for people to mature? Um, Now, clearly, one way of looking at the problem of maturation is that it's a move from a state of being immature to a state of being mature. And we've asked people this question many times over the years to give us a set of binary opposites that are consistent with that distinction of being immature and mature. And what you have here is a reasonably consistent set of binary opposites that would reflect the sorts of things that people would say. So they would say, for instance, immature people are selfish, mature people are generous, immature people can't listen, mature people can listen, immature people are subjective, mature people are objective, and so on. There's a list that's be very consistent with this. And the problem is very often that that list gets quite long. And one then suddenly kind of gets the sense of being trapped in a morass of detail, and you can no longer see the sort of the wood for the trees. But it occurs to me that if you look at those themes, then there is an essence to it which becomes apparent when you consider what maturation actually is concerned with. I mean, if you view maturation as a process, and the question is, well, how would you define a process? Any process, a metabolic process, a production process, an administrative process. If you describe something as a process, surely what you're describing is something that moves incrementally from a beginning to an end. That's what a process does. And a process is an incremental move from a start to a finish. And if you see maturation through that lens, you say, well, at what point does the process start? And at what point does the process end? And clearly, the process starts at birth and ends at death. Now, often people would say, but I mean, that's kind of obvious. I mean, you're not really saying anything. But actually, from the point of view of the issue of intent, this is kind of very significant, because these two moments of birth and death are the only truly unconditional moments that you face in your life. I mean, surely at birth, the infant has had nothing yet. So whatever the infant is going to get, it will still get. The question is at death. Can you take anything with you when you die? And clearly you can't take anything with you when you die. So at death, you don't get anything. You give everything unconditionally. But there is a challenge to that, and that is to say, listen, when I die, I don't give everything unconditionally. Everything gets taken away from me unconditionally, and clearly this is true. But then that only invokes another question, and that question would be, then what's the difference between getting something and giving something? I mean, let's assume you have 1,000 rand stolen from you. This is experience A. And in experience B, you give 1,000 rand to a neighbor who's about to lose his house. The neighbor can't pay the bond, and they ask you for a donation so that they can keep the house, and you give the person 1,000 rand to save the house. Now the question is there a difference between the money having been stolen from you and you giving the money? And yes, there is. And the interesting thing is that this distinction doesn't sit in the 1,000 rand. It could conceivably be the same 1,000 rand. So the difference between giving something and having it taken from you does not sit in the objective event. It sits in the intent of the person who's going through the experience. If you have the 1,000 rand stolen from you, your intent was not to give, which means you experienced that it was taken from you. Whereas when you gave the 1,000 rand, your intent was to give. Now, if you consider these two possibilities to be absolutely inevitable, it's like death. It's definitely going to happen. The experience where you give the 1,000 rand and the experience where the 1,000 rand gets taken away from you. The question is, which one of those two experiences can you describe as the successful experience? And clearly, the successful experience is the one where you gave, which basically means to suggest that since death is inevitable, It has to mean to succeed at this issue, it has to mean to cultivate the capacity to give unconditionally. The process of maturation is concerned with the process of the maturation of intent to give unconditionally. And if you see it as process, then a further thing that this implies is that it's increments. Because another way of understanding process is like various shades of gray. You start off sort of on the extreme left-hand side here with the dark, going lighter, 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 lighter to absolute light. And if you see it through that lens, then what becomes apparent is that as you mature, there's a change in the proportion of the mix of your intent. And if you saw through this lens of mix and you say, well, let's separate the light and dark out, it suggests that as you mature, there's a change of the degree to which you either act on the basis of what you want to get or what you can give. And this distinction actually gets presented to you moment by moment. So if you say, that's me, and in any situation, I can either construct my intent on what I'm trying to get, or I can construct my intent on what I can give. And these two things work differently. If I construct my intent on what I want to get, then clearly what I get comes from other to self. Whereas when I construct my intent on what I give leaves me for the other. Now, what this suggests is that when I'm comparatively immature, in other words, on the left-hand side of this middle line, I mean, if you consider that this is a proportional thing, so it's absolute dark going lighter, 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 to a point where you've got, if you like, 51% darkness in the shade. It means that in any situation at the point, I more frequently than not would give attention to what I'm getting. So I'm comparatively immature. Once I've crossed the border, then more frequently than not, I give attention to what I'm giving. I act on the basis of what sits there, which means I'm comparatively mature. Now, if this is true, if we say that the process of maturation is concerned with the process of the maturation of intent to give unconditionally, then actually all the other binary opposites make sense. Using this understanding as a coat hanger, or if you like, as a spine, to hold the content. But it makes sense in two categories. The first category is, in a sense, the more obvious one. I mean, one of the things that's true for immature people is when an immature person walks into a situation, they will give attention to their own expectations. Whereas a mature person would walk into exactly the same situation and they don't give attention to their expectations. They ask themselves, how can I help here? What is the contribution I can make? Which basically means to say that immature people are fundamentally selfish with how they deal with things, and mature people are fundamentally generous with how they deal with this things. There's a generosity of spirit with mature people. There's a kindness, and that kindness gets translated into really their sort of basic demeanor to the world. So, for instance, this is why we don't experience immature people as being able to listen and mature people as being able to listen. This kind of resonates with the EQ kind of distinction between low EQ and high EQ. Because if you consider listening as a skill, I mean, let's say, for instance, you must have had a conversation with somebody in your life where you've tried to explain something to the person and they've answered you back before you finish speaking. If you're married, you've certainly had that experience. Now, if you consider what that means, I mean, let's say, for example, you're trying to say something to me, and as you open your mouth, I finish your sentence for you. So you try again and I answer you back. I mean, this is a really miserable experience. Clearly, from your point of view, there's two agendas in the room. There's my agenda and then there's your agenda. And insofar as I'm answering you back, I'm giving attention to my own agenda. I'm only listening to myself. So the question is, well, what do I need to do with my agenda before I'm in the position to listen to you? Surely that requires me to be able to suspend my agenda. In other words, listening requires me to suspend my agenda for the agenda of the other in the situation that I'm in. Which is why we can actually define listening as a moral skill, because giving requires you to suspend your agenda for the agenda of the other in the situation that you're in. When you are selfish, you cannot suspend your agenda for the other. When you are generous, you suspend your agenda for the other. Now, all of these other sort of implications of rationality and so on, these are all a further implication to this core, you see, because if you consider this issue of subjectivity and objectivity. I mean, Let's assume I've not learned this lesson of being able to suspend my agenda for yours when you're trying to speak to me. So I can't listen. I only listen to myself. In other words, I'm only giving attention to my own agenda. While I'm only giving attention to my agenda, the question is, where does my agenda sit? Does it sit in my subject or does it sit in my object? And clearly it sits in my subject. So while I'm only listening to my agenda, you experience me as subjective, you experience me as irrational, you experience me as emotional, and you experience me as judgmental. When I suspend my agenda for your agenda, because your agenda sits in my object, you will experience me as objective, you experience me as rational, you experience me as reflective, you experience me as having an open mind. The further thing that's true for the difference between immature people and mature people is that basically immature people, rather mature people are able to confront, and immature people really find it difficult to confront. So in a sense, there's a second set of categories that have a bit of a tougher kind of implication. When, immature people are needs driven in their behavior. Mature people are values driven in their behavior. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. I mean, if you consider honesty as a value. So what does it mean to be honest? Clearly, being honest means being truthful. I mean, I don't think any definition of honesty would make sense if it didn't reflect this issue of truthfulness. Honesty is about truthfulness. Now, let's assume you ask me where I live, and I tell you I live near Johannesburg in South Africa. I'm telling you the truth about where I live, so I'm subscribing to the criterion of truthfulness. The question is, do you know I'm an honest person? And actually you don't. And the reason for this is that there's no harm to me to speak the truth about where I live, However, if you asked me about something that could potentially harm my own interests and I still speak the truth, have you now demonstrated something about my honesty? And yes, you have. In other words, you only demonstrate that I'm an honest person when I stay honest when it is not in my interest to do so, which suggests that values refer to an order of reality which is bigger than your self-interest, against which you put your self-interest second. Value-driven people do what is right. Needs-driven people do what's expedient. It suggests that value-driven people are fundamentally courageous with how they deal with things, and needs-driven people are cowardly. They cover their wickets. They look after themselves. They cannot take a bullet for something. And because that is the case, we can therefore say that a further difference between immature people and mature people is that immature people are irresponsible and that they blame and they do expedient things, whereas mature people are responsible, they're accountable, and they're trustworthy. Because if you consider the value judgment you're making when you consider somebody to be trustworthy. Let's say, for instance, I define somebody to be trustworthy. There's a number of implications to that. The first thing I'll be saying to myself is I believe that when this person is faced with the distinction between what's right and what's in their own interests, they'll do the right thing. Because they'll do the right thing, they're responsible. I believe that when this person is faced with that distinction, they do what is right rather than what's expedient, and therefore they'll be able to accept accountability for the situation that they're in. Whereas if I make the opposite call, if I consider somebody to be irresponsible, what I'm really saying is that I think that when this person is faced with the distinction between what's right and what's expedient, they'll act on the basis of what's expedient. They'll act in their own interests. They'll blame everybody else when things go wrong, and you cannot trust them. Which means to say that the key to the distinction between immaturity and maturity is this distinction between getting and giving. Mature people are people who are here to give. They're people who act consistently with either the generosity or the courage that's operative in the situation that they're in. And what one has to understand is that this problem of struggling between the intent to get and the intent to give is actually a moment-by-moment thing, and really is the architecture whereby we grow. So, for instance, if we look at this cradle-to-grave story and sort of put some perspective on it, so in any moment that you're in, sort of you're always confronted by a situation. So if that's me, I'm standing in a situation, I'm confronted by a situation. There's one of two ways I can deal with that situation. I can either deal with that situation on the basis of what I want to get. And the moment I do that, I create the condition where the situation defines me. And there's a rule to this. If I want something from somebody else, that person's ability to withhold what I want gives them power over me. We call it the watch rule. Let's say, for example, you have a watch and I'm in the same room as you and I want the watch. If I want the watch from you, who can withhold the watch? Clearly, you can withhold the watch. In other words, who's got power over you? It means you've got power over me. If I want something from somebody else, that person's ability to withhold what I want gives them power over me. It makes me vulnerable and manipulable. It basically creates the condition where the situation becomes bigger than me. I get defined by the situation. In other words, I get stuck. I stagnate. In order to grow, I need to ask myself, what is the contribution I can make here? What can I give? Because the moment I do that, I'm acting for something which is bigger than my self-interest. And in acting for something which is bigger than my self-interest, I can rise out of myself and take the next step forward in my growth. And in fact, every moment that you're alive has exactly that architecture to it. Let's say for there, I'm in a situation, confronted by a situation. I ask myself, what is the right thing to do? I rise out of myself and I take the next step forward in my growth, and I'm in a new situation. Again, I ask myself, how can I help? What is the contribution I can make? I rise out of myself and I take the next step forward in my growth. Which means to say that not only is it true to say that maturity means being here to give, or acting consistently with the generosity or the courage that's operative in the situation that you're in. It also suggests that maturation, growing, is about acting consistently with what is the appropriate thing to give in the situation that you're in. Thank you very much.